From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on protest movements in Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon. While each case is unique, all three movements are pushing for sweeping reforms of the corrupt political system, a change in the ruling elite, and improved state services. Algeria's Hirak social movement began in mid-February 2019, after President Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced he would run for a fifth term. Protests soon brought his two-decade-long rule to an end, and the Hirak has since morphed into a nationwide, leaderless movement calling for a total overhaul of the political system. Protests in Iraq broke out on October 1st, driven by deficient state services, high unemployment, rampant corruption, and the failures of the sectarian power-sharing system. The protesters have faced a violent crackdown, which has seen at least 600 killed and thousands more injured. Prime Minister Adel Abdelmahdi resigned at the end of November, and the political system has been in crisis ever since. Lebanon's protests began on October 17th against the backdrop of a massive economic and banking crisis. Driven by a rejection of the decades-long corruption and mismanagement of the country's ruling elite and sectarian political system, the protests led to the resignation of Prime Minister Saad Hariri at the end of October. To help us make sense of where things stand now and the impact of COVID-19 on these movements, we're joined today by three great guests: Vish Sakthivel, Hafsa Halawa, and Nour El-Achi. Vish is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and will be joining Yale University's Council on Middle Eastern Studies this summer. Hafsa is a non-resident scholar at MEI and an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Nour is an activist in Lebanon's October 17th revolution. Vish, Hafsa, Nour, thank you for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Vish, the protest movement in Algeria has been going strong for over a year before the outbreak of COVID-19. How has it adapted to the new reality and where do things stand now?
Well, firstly, Alistair, thank you for having me. I would only add to your otherwise thorough summary that Hirak has been pretty unusual in its levels of popular support and legitimacy relative to past Algerian protest movements, which I think it's been able to accomplish largely by sort of trespassing on the state's own legitimating language and symbolism, of being the voice of the people as the rightful executor of this anti-colonial revolution. And so over the year, it's morphed into the sort of massive movement that has come to represent the new Algerian unanimity. And it was able to mobilize people through the sort of constant pervasive occupation and interruption of public space. And so in terms of where it stands with COVID, I think one of the major ways the outbreak is helping autocratic regimes and curbing these types of popular checks on autocratic power is by, kind of stripping these dissenting movements of access to this kinds of space. It's a really fundamental piece of mobilization. Public space allows groups to physically come together and convene various demands and grievances, but also signal to authorities the extent of their size, their support, their influence, all of which have been instrumental in Hirak's cultivation of legitimacy and power as a political player. And, in Algeria, the streets and the public squares is where, citizens who are taking part in Hirak from different walks of life and even opposing, rival political tendencies could sort of unify to, forge new ideas of what it meant to be an Algerian, of what it meant to be a patriot. It's what gave citizens these new feelings of civic ownership and responsibility, and that they were able to kind of take back public space from the regime. And so now with the space unavailable, it has definitely raised the conundrum to Hirak of, okay, what does mobilization look like now, and what methods should we turn to?
Also, in Iraq, it seems like the protest movement was flagging a bit before the onset of the pandemic. How has the situation evolved since then?
Thanks, Alistair, and it's great to be invited back to contribute to the podcast. Well, really what we saw in Iraq was not so much a flagging in terms of popular support, but really the momentum that it had vis-a-vis the political elite and the ability to influence the political transition, shall we say, after the resignation of Adel Abdelmahdi in November. And the reality is that the political elites continued sort of tit-for-tat political hand-wringing, attempting to reach some kind of conclusion that all parts of the Muhassasa system are satisfied with, still remains something that increasingly, now that the protests are suspended because of the COVID-19 outbreak, is moving and running independently of the protest movement. What that means for the country itself is that the political crisis is not only set to continue, it's set to continue to ignore the grievances of the protesters. And the various measures taken by the governments, for obvious reasons, social distancing, curfew in place, measures related to lockdowns like we've seen across the world, will have a massive direct economic impact on civilians, particularly the majority of the country who work within the informal economy and depend on sort of day-to-day salaries or paycheck to paycheck, like we say. And what that is likely to do in the longer term is increase anger towards the government, particularly without a resolution on a new prime minister and cabinet. And as the lockdown eases, I'm pretty sure we're going to see a resurgence similar to what we're starting to see now in Lebanon, which I'm sure Nour will talk to, in Iraq as well as we come out of this.
Nour, on precisely that point, what's going on in Lebanon and how have things played out there?
So first, thanks for having me. I want to start by saying that when you're constantly on the streets and protesting on daily basis and fighting for your freedom, adapting to a new reality where you are confined in your own home and can't go outside is just really hard, of course. So at first, for some protesters, they were really frustrated that they even downplayed the risks of the virus, with some even going as far as wanting to believe that it's just another flu. But of course, the situation changed when reports started coming out of other countries where the pandemic hit hard. And we came to accept that the mobilization part of our revolution will have to be put on hold temporarily, of course, because one of our values as activists is to act responsible towards the well-being and health of the Lebanese citizens. So we were able to bend the curve through responsible decisions that we took before the government even acted. For example, we canceled the Women's March on Women's Day. And but to be honest, we never really stopped our work. Even if the physical mobilization was put on hold, we continued our political work because we want to hold the Lebanese government and political parties accountable to the whole situation. And we also continued to be watchdogs for the government's decisions. But we also decided to shift our resources towards social work and supporting our community because we knew in a way that something had to be done towards the community. We directly started to hold our meetings online, and I think just by seeing and talking to people that stood by our side for the last couple of months was just a relief. And I want to add that 2 weeks before the outbreak took place, we, as a group of activists, had launched our movement called Min Tishrin, which is a youth-led progressive movement seeking to build a modern, civil, and democratic country based on social justice, rule of law, and respect of human rights. And the name itself, as a movement, has a double meaning in Arabic. First, it means to spread in Lebanon and all over the Lebanese diaspora. And it also refers to the month of October, which is from Min Tishrin. So we took that time to basically organize ourselves and structure our work, because, you know, when you are constantly on the ground, all the projects and initiatives and campaigns are just improvised in a way.
Vish, I wanted to circle back to a point that you made earlier. How is the act of protesting changing given the need for social distancing and the imposition of measures to combat the spread of the virus? Given the fact that activists in Algeria can't take to the streets and physically occupy public space, how are they mobilizing?
So I think Iraq's answer to its own question of, what should mobilization look like now? How do we contend with this loss of access to public space? It in many ways echoes what Nour has told us about, the Lebanese protest movement kind of taking matters into its own hands. Iraq and Algeria has now turned to focusing more squarely on what many are sure will be a lackluster public health response given just the utter lack of public trust and also pandemic readiness. Iraq is using its existing avenues of online activism to express grievances that specifically call out the shortcomings of Algeria's health infrastructure, as well as some of the vulnerability to economic shocks that will certainly challenge its system of subsidies in the upcoming recession, and in general, just its poor governance and leadership. And all of this is done through, online broadcasts, cartoons, comedy, memes, Facebook groups. One group of Iraq activists notably formed a radio channel earlier mid-March called Radio Corona Internacional, which convenes in the sort of biweekly manner in a way that's really sort of mirrors the biweekly nature of the protests. If those out there who are following Algeria, if you haven't heard of Radio Corona International, definitely check it out. It's very funny, sort of lighthearted, and it's sort of in line with this whole concept of silmiya, this very peaceful provocation and mockery of the regime. And so we see these really earnest efforts to kind of sustain the spirit of both togetherness and dissent through internet space. And it's really effective in that these forums kind of gain these huge followings very quickly since the lockdown.
Nour, to what extent has there been, and you kind of touched on this a bit earlier, a shift to digital tactics among activists in Lebanon since the onset of the pandemic? And how successful has that been compared to the kind of on-the-ground activism?
Yeah, so I'm not going to use the word shift here because, to be honest, it was almost an instantaneous teleport to the digital world. We went from being 24/7 together physically on the street to 24/7 quarantine. But thank God for Zoom. Now we are 24/7 on Zoom and other applications. And to be honest, this had a lot of positive outcomes. For example, the meetings that used to be postponed 2 to 3 times, whether it's for nonstop ground actions or people not being able to make it, are actually now happening. And our productivity level has increased, to be honest. We took that time to communicate more, to strategize more, and reach out to other activists, movements, and groups basically inside and outside of Lebanon. And that time helped us to align our work and organize ourselves more. It made us feel even more unified. I personally met people that I never got the chance to meet on the streets. I connected with the Lebanese diaspora, all of us as activists, and now we're working together and we meet with them on a daily basis. So we just discovered that we are slowly becoming a community, one that has a noble cause, one that you can rely on during rough times. And of course, we launched several campaigns as revolution groups. We also discussed the parliamentary session that was described as a hoax when the parliamentary blocs of political parties collaborated to vote against every reformist law proposition, such as lifting banking secrecy, lifting immunities on ministers, and also voted against the removal of politician photos from public spaces. So the idea here is that we kept on working online, even if the physical movements were stopped in a way.
Hafsa, how has the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis been perceived within Iraq? And has that underscored or exacerbated some of the problems that sparked the protest movement in the first place?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously, and this isn't unique to Iraq, or even from what we're hearing from Lebanon and Algeria. I think across the region, dominated by sort of authoritarian practices and lack of transparency and accountability, all of the countries and the response to COVID-19 has brought into the limelight the grievances felt by the general public, by citizens, in terms of not just exposure and risks of infection and the strength or durability of the healthcare system. But I think what's really apparent in the Iraqi response, and we've seen it in some other cases, is the crackdown in terms of civil society and media transparency. So we've definitely seen citizens' massive part of the protest movement, similar to what Nour described in Lebanon, move online. We've got campaigns in terms of teaching people how to look after their health, things about, videos that women's civil society leaders are instructing people how to effectively wash their hands, and certain measures people can take to help stave off the infection or the virus itself. But all of the stories we have in terms of how the government is responding to COVID-19, beyond official figures from the health ministries within the KRI and in Baghdad, is very much anecdotal, because we've had general crackdowns on the media. So, we know that certainly the grievances are exacerbated from a security perspective. And we do know that the sort of PMU groups, and putting aside the fact that there's been a lot of political movement vis-a-vis the PMUs, the Hashd Shabi, and splits within them. But as a general sort of perception, they've been managing and monitoring security over hospitals. They've been preventing doctors from speaking out about certain areas that may be experiencing stressed healthcare systems. And they're stepping in some areas and providing sort of charity and support to more vulnerable communities, but in a disparaging manner. So, of course, social cohesion questions, tensions within communities are being exacerbated at the same time. So everything is certainly heightened. I think more, Iraq's case specifically, of course, adding to that is the massive oil price collapse and the real economic struggles that the country is, it's really starting to hit them in the face now. And again, no functioning government, a caretaker government that hasn't got the authority to make significant decisions, particularly ones we know are coming on questions of austerity, budget, and so forth. And really just this complete feeling of stagnation across the board, much more so than there was before. And ultimately, indeed, that's exacerbating tensions across all forms of all different communities, whether they be the core protest centers or the more vulnerable communities in areas with high displacement ratio, or the liberated post-conflict areas.
Vish, pivoting back to Algeria, given the widespread lack of trust in the Algerian government, to what extent has the Hirak been able to leverage its credibility to play a role in dealing with the outbreak by promoting awareness and aiding efforts to combat the disease?
Yeah, so the widespread public distrust that I mentioned is sort of leading Hirak to not only call out the state's poor response, but also using the opportunity to fill in state gaps and sort of carve out a role, almost as a health service provider. It has sort of leaned on the medical and scientific expertise found within the movement's own membership to kind of create public messaging with more credibility, promoting awareness of how exactly the disease spreads, echoing a lot of the repertoires that Hafsa mentioned in Iraq. And so, those public posters that are kind of praising health workers that we've seen around the US and Europe. Well, Algeria, we see a lot of those as well. And Hirak is actually responsible for many of those similar posters. And in some ways, so it's sort of substituted out protest with this sort of work, kind of immediately altering its repertoire of activities to sort of mobilize, donations, foodstuffs, tissue, cleaning supplies, medical supplies to harder hit areas. It has set up these sort of crowdfunding drives to get protective gear to health workers in poor hospitals, and effectively kind of just turning into this really large sort of nationwide charitable network, which of course, I think all observers of the Middle East know that this type of outreach, has politics of its own. It's something that Islamist movements the region over have kind of widely used and it's kind of widely written about, and that it sort of works to confirm public distrust of the state and leads citizens to kind of trust the non-state provider instead. And as a result, it can also, the movement can in this way kind of encroach on the state's symbolic position as the sort of benevolent, providential caretaker.
Nour, I'm curious to get your opinion on this as well. The coronavirus crisis has created a bunch of new needs for things like food, medicine, shelter. This is particularly true in Lebanon, given the large refugee population and the massive economic crisis. How are activists in Lebanon helping to respond to these changing needs?
Well, Lebanon's economy was collapsing before the corona outbreak, but in a way, the pandemic was a catalyst that resulted in accelerating that collapse. So we knew that something had to be done to stand next to most marginalized community, especially that from the get-go, it was clear that political parties will be trying to take advantage of that situation, just like they always try to do, and buy their loyalty through assistance and minimal help. They also only help their supporters. We know that. So Minteshreen, with of course other groups and activists, worked on several initiatives to help during these tough times. First, we launched the Food Box initiative that we are currently distributing all over Lebanon. And until now, we managed to distribute more than 1,000 boxes. And we actually went from buying the boxes from suppliers to now gathering all the different items and creating the boxes ourselves. And we are basically using our homes and building entrances as storages. And then we realized when the corona cases started to rise that it is important to provide accommodation for the first responders that can go back to their family houses because they are exposed to the virus on a daily basis. So we decided to launch an initiative called Baytna Baytak, which means my home is your home, that we initiated by reaching out to our network and created a communication campaign to be able to secure apartments and hotel rooms to first responders. And until now, we were able to house more than 300 doctors, medical workers, Red Cross members, and first responders. And as you know, now people are taking back to the street while the corona pandemic is still out there. So we decided to create a mask production line with the help of some designers. And what we do is we make sure that we employ tailors, and then we sell these masks so we can give out these masks in the upcoming protests. So, but to be honest, no matter how much we help, nothing will be enough. The situation escalated in a very dramatic way. And you know that according to the World Bank, 50% of the Lebanese population are living under poverty line. And I want to give an example. So in Tripoli, which is the poorest city in the Mediterranean Sea, people took back to the streets stating that they would rather die from corona than out of hunger. So that's how bad it is.
Vish, in Algeria, the government seems to have used the pandemic as an opportunity to go after activists and journalists. According to Human Rights Watch, over the past month and a half, at least 20 activists have been called in for questioning, arrested, or sentenced on charges. How widespread is this crackdown, and how much of an impact is it having?
So the interesting element of repression in Algeria is that it's been sort of strategic in how it represses. You know, it's sort of widely understood that authoritarian regimes, even presumed democracies, will kind of seize upon times of crisis, COVID-19, the period after 9/11 to sort of limit freedoms, control information, and just generally just consolidate power. But the sort of like unhinged repression that I think some people thought would kind of follow hasn't quite materialized in Algeria. It seems to me that the regime has been a little bit more tentative in its approach to curbing transmission. Morocco, for instance, had like military tanks rolling in the street after the lockdown was announced, which is something that would have just been politically impossible in Algeria. Algeria has also not implemented as strict a lockdown as its neighbors. And I think that this is in part so that it would have some room to maneuver in sustaining the pre-existing modes of repression that sort of preceded the pandemic, specifically the arrest and detentions of journalists, comedians, and activists, as you mentioned. Ahead of the lockdown, the regime was already sort of gradually identifying who were the various leaders in different localities among, the students, the lawyers, the workers, the journalists, all around the country. Plainclothes police officers were sort of beginning to infiltrate Iraq and identify leaders, preparing files on their activities and gathering intel, which of course caused some extent of paranoia and dropping out of Iraq in a lot of areas. So the coercive apparatus was really consolidating even ahead of the pandemic, sort of between the security service, the DGSN, the Justice Ministry, just sort of coordinating to jail identified people kind of unilaterally without really any transparency or due process. So I think what the pandemic is now allowing authorities to do is sort of to speed up trials and sentencing while the accused have very little recourse because of the lockdown. And I think since lockdown, something like 20 activists have been held in pretrial detention, and some of them very high-profile figures like Karim Tabu, Khalid Rarani, Abdul Wahab Farsawi. So in many ways, these detentions are being accelerated, but in other ways, they're sort of a continuation of the sort of repression as usual.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to get each of your thoughts about where you see things heading moving forward. Hafsa, let's start with you and Iraq.
Sure, thanks. Well, on the political side, certainly the continued inability to allow or have a new government come in looks set to continue. The third Prime Minister designate, Mustafa Kadhimi, is unlikely, despite a flurry of support, as we've seen with previous Prime Minister designates in the first sort of week to 10 days of their nomination. He now looks increasingly unlikely to be able to form a government. We'll find out in the coming few days into early May. His deadline is May 9th officially, but having set himself a deadline of the 1st of Ramadan, which was on April 23rd, he's now sort of at the end of the month submitted his request to Parliament and will probably look to call for a vote soon. So we'll know very soon if we're looking for another fourth Prime Minister designate, a very likely outcome. So politically, my personal view is that this is the slow and crumbling decline that's been in place over many years of the political muhassasa system that apportions power, very broadly speaking, along ethno-sectarian lines. And what we've been witnessing probably since the start of the war against ISIS, but accentuated by the 2018 elections, is the slow erosion where the patronage and the apportionment of power is no longer is no longer functioning. The powers that be or the political elite are no longer able to apportion this in a way that suits everybody. And this is going to be accelerated by the COVID-19 outbreak, and not just necessarily inside Iraq, but the global downturn, the economic downturn, and the massive economic stress the country is going to be under with the collapse in oil prices that will not recover by any means enough by the end of this calendar year for the country to be able to, say, balance its books, as it were. And all of that is sort of a perfect storm. We have ongoing tensions between the KRG government in Kurdistan and the federal government, caretaker government in Baghdad over payments. We have protesters getting angrier, a public that is increasingly frustrated by the lockdown and the curfew amid a very festive month of Ramadan traditionally. And we are heading into summer where Iraq generally experiences electricity cuts, power cuts, and anger tends to boil over generally on an annual basis during that time. So I expect a much more strengthened and angrier protest movement as the PMU and the Hashd al-Shabi forces become more splintered and without really unified leadership. I expect a small but much more violent response, quote unquote state sponsored, but not specifically state sponsored, in response to more violent protests and complete political breakdown across the board. I mean, Iraq really is heading towards the biggest crisis it's faced in, I would say, in the last 17 years.
Nour, how about you? How do you see the situation in Lebanon developing going forward?
So, as I told you before, we expect difficult times ahead, and we will continue supporting our community as much as possible while continuing to be watchdogs for the government. But this time, our main challenge is to consolidate our efforts as revolution groups and create a unified front to be able to become a key player in the internal politics and to be able to influence a decision-making process that we consider was kidnapped in a way by political parties that have lost their political legitimacy a long time ago. And the task here is not easy at all, and it requires a high sense of responsibility, humility, and setting our differences aside. We just need to focus on being the answer. At the end of the day, the current government represent these political parties that have been ruling for the last 30 years and led us to nothing but corruption, social injustice, and economy collapse. People are getting back to the streets. There is more frustration, more anger. There will be violence, more violence, in my opinion. And of course, now that people are back in the streets, we also have a major responsibility to limit the effect that the mobilization has in terms of spreading the virus. So it's something that we are also working on.
Vish, you've got the last word. In a piece you wrote for MEI at the beginning of April, you said COVID-19 presents a political opportunity for the Iraq and Algeria. Do you think they'll be able to seize that opportunity and take on a more expansive role in the future?
I think that remains to be seen. Obviously this pandemic is sort of totally upending the sort of political orders, economic systems, and social arrangements that, we've all taken for granted up until now. So, what will Algeria and Iraq, look like when this is all over? I really can't say. I mean, the country has already been sort of economically vulnerable, and this will no doubt be exacerbated, as will the state of the global economy. But what I can say is that the ranks of Iraq appear pretty determined not to let any of this dampen their movement. I've written in the past, I think elsewhere, that Iraq is probably among, if not the most powerful and legitimate unformalized non-state entities to arise in post-independence Algeria. Before Iraq, anti-state sentiment was something that you didn't really outwardly say, but now it's been revealed not only as widespread, but even popularized by Iraq as a new expression of patriotism. And so, there was some protest fatigue toward the end, just before the pandemic. But this level of momentum and this level of social influence is not something that I think Iraq is going to be willing to give up so easily. I think many observers also think that this fear of losing this momentum might even shock some of the free riders out of their complacency and maybe elicit even more involvement in Iraq as time goes on. And as to the question of whether it will take a more expansive role in, health policy or service provision, or maybe even in governance, I think it's a question for sure. Iraq's lack of links to formal administration, to government, and its sort of status as the voice of the people, a stand-in for the people, is what underpins its credibility. And this is true in many Arab countries, where being sort of a non-state grouping whose activities purport to fill the gaps of state retreat is partly what allows the work to be effective at all. And of course, I think there have been some cases of cooperation in Algeria with the local belediyas, the local councils. Nevertheless, I imagine that Iraq, in order to sustain its legitimacy, not only as a movement, but increasingly as a service provider, it will, or at least it should, I think, continue its state bypass and resist efforts to co-opt it. And whether all of this, this dynamic is going to be carried into the end of the pandemic, a timeline which is really sort of unknown, we'll see.
We'll have to leave things there for today. But Vish, Hafsa, Nour, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you as well to our listeners for tuning in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.